Mr. Tharoor, thank you so much for speaking with Mirror Now, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Good to meet you, Faye.
I want to start off with your new book, Why I Am a Hindu. It's a very interesting title, and it's a very interesting point, in our country's current environment, to talk about why you are a Hindu. Is there a necessity right now to reaffirm your Hinduism?
I believe so, because what's happening is that, unfortunately, the ruling dispensation has essentially hijacked the idea of Hinduism for a very narrow-minded, bigoted and sectarian version of the faith, which is being propagated from the rooftops. I don't believe the Hinduism that I grew up with and the vast majority of Hindus in this country grew up with is a Hinduism that condones killing people in the name of protecting the cow, or assaulting others because they have a different faith, or for that matter bringing down a mosque because it happens to be standing on territory once occupied by a temple. All of these things are violative of the sort of Hinduism that Swami Vivekananda preached, that most of us were brought up to believe in. Swami Vivekananda famously said in Chicago in 1893 that Hinduism teaches not just tolerance but acceptance. Tolerance is a good thing. Everyone thinks it's a virtue, but it's still ultimately patronizing. Because a tolerant person says, I have the truth, you are in error, but I will magnanimously indulge you in your right to be wrong. Whereas the Hindu way is to say, I believe I have the truth, you believe you have the truth, I will respect your truth, please respect my truth. We'll get along just fine. That's the basic premise of the Hinduism that Swami Vivekananda taught, that many of us were brought up to believe in and practice. In a multi-religious country like ours, respect for and acceptance of the other is the only way we can actually successfully manage our diversity. So in many ways, the liberal Hinduism that I knew and that most Indians have grown up with is actually a counterpart to the political democracy, the plural democracy enshrined in our constitution.
Forgive me.
Reducing this Hinduism to a sort of chauvinist rampage is what I'm fighting against.
Forgive me for being cynical, but we just had the Gujarat elections where Rahul Gandhi visited several temples. We have the Karnataka elections where the Chief Minister Siddaramaiah is constantly visiting temples as well. Is this part of a political strategy to say we're also Hindu, or we're Hindu as well, or,
I write books for myself. I'm an individual author. This is my 17th book, and none of them, I think, have been particularly in any way had anything to do with my subsequent political career as a Congress.
Which is why this is interesting now.
Well, I've prefigured some of these concerns in some of my earlier books. The emphasis on dharma and the great Indian novel, the whole exploration of Hindu-Muslim violence and riot, my discussions in India from Midnight to the Millennium, which was written just 4 years after the Babri Masjid happened, to talk about exactly some of the issues and themes that have now come back at full length in this volume. What happened really is that the urgency to gather my thoughts from various years of reflection and put them into a new message today, that urgency comes from indeed the way in which the prominent public and political discourse of the country has been taken over by a different sort of Hinduism. Hindutva is actually not Hinduism. It's a distortion of Hinduism. And it's time, I think, that believing Hindus stood up and said, let's talk about this. In the old days, Hindus, frankly, had the approach, we were brought up to believe that religion was a private, personal matter between you and your maker, or your idea of the divine. You pray quietly in private, don't discuss it in public. That was the usual attitude for most Hindus. And I certainly practiced my faith that way. Whatever I did before in my puja room or in the texts I read and reflected on was for myself. That's what Hinduism taught me. I was to seek the truth within myself, and it was not for going around pontificating outside, unless, of course, you are a guru or a sadhu, in which case you're entitled to do so. I'm not. But now it's reached a point where if you do practice Hinduism that way and keep silent about it publicly, you essentially abdicate the space to a whole bunch of people who are overt in their professions of religiosity, but are actually traducing the faith in whose name they came to speak.
With all due respect, where does that leave the minorities? If we have two large political parties, both wrangling now to be more Hindu or Hindu as well, it sends a clear message that you have to be Hindu in order to be Indian.
No, that's precisely the difference. So the Congress Party's Hinduism says this is not a Hinduism that is exclusive. On the contrary, it is an inclusive, accepting, welcoming Hinduism. You said that Congress party leaders are going to temples. Yes. I go to temples, but I also go to mosques and churches in my constituency, Thiruvananthapuram. Well, I'm sure that they should, because honestly, where there are people, obviously, you don't go and hunt for a mosque where there are no people, shall we say, in that particular area who use the mosque. But if there are, of course, you must show them respect. The whole purpose of political leadership is to represent all the people. As an MP for Thiruvananthapuram, I represent my Muslim and Christian voters as much as I represent the Hindu voters. In the last 9 years, except for last year when I had a family reason, that is my son's wedding receptions, I have spent every single Christmas Eve for the last 9 years at 4 different churches, ending up at the midnight mass in the Catholic cathedral, but going earlier to the Orthodox, to the Anglican, the Church of South India, and to the Marthoma churches. This is something I've done routinely every year in my constituency, because it's a way of saying to my people, I'm with you in your big moment of celebration and joy. This festival matters to you. You matter to me. Therefore, here I am amidst you. It doesn't make me a Christian. It doesn't make me a, quote, minority appeaser. It just shows me to be somebody who, while being proud of his Hinduism, respects the faith of his constituents.
Well, since we're talking about that, and we just came out of what we're now calling the Padmavat mess, because that's what it was, and it stopped only after there were stones thrown on children in a school bus. But while the state governments in question did very little to get a control of law and order in their own states,
that's right, the
opposition was surprisingly quiet. Why was that?
Well, I plead not guilty. I spoke up at the time, and I spoke up also in a press conference in which I said that it worries me that states which are, of course, the responsibility for law and order is with the state government, not with the central government, but the state governments, that they have not shown absolutely any interest in quelling these disturbances, which were entirely predictable. These chaps were threatening violence from the rooftops. So it would have been prudent, at the very least, to take precautionary measures, to insist that these fellows not be allowed to congregate in numbers which could menace the security and safety of the public, and to clamp down the moment troubles began, none of which happened. So my question is, are there some issues on which the state governments are reluctant to quell the rioters? Because surely every citizen, every voter in those states is entitled to peace and tranquility and law and order. That's a basic right of every citizen of this country. Surely the state government has a greater obligation to protect their peace and liberty than to appease those who would use violence and essentially reduce India's image in the world. There is a Prime Minister standing in Davos talking about India as a non-violent land, while school buses are being stoned and the Haryana Roadways bus was burned, was actually set alight. Now this kind of stuff has to shame somebody in authority. And clearly those in authority were not adequately shamed. I hope the courts will actually step in. I think unless the courts start exemplary action, not just arresting these people and letting them go on bail and then forgetting about it, which is what happens most of the time, but actually fining them. When an organization has said it will conduct violence, it conducts violence, it destroys public property. Why shouldn't they be required to pay for it?
But before we move on from the topic, since we are talking about why you are a Hindu and not abdicating that space, what's your response to the demand for a Hindu Rashtra?
Well, it's a completely, I reject that notion. In fact, I've talked about it in the book. The book is, the first half more or less is indeed about my Hinduism, including some of my doubts and questions about it, some of my criticisms of issues like the caste system, and at the same time, my understanding of its spiritual underpinnings and its philosophical inquiries. Having talked about all that, as well as the Hinduism I've observed, watched people like my father practice, and the Hinduism, therefore, that I grew up with, as well as the Hinduism I learned and read about, I then turned to Hindutva. And I study in some detail, in their own words, the writings of Savarkar, Golwalkar, Deendayal Upadhyay. And I try not to in the initial thing criticize, I just summarize what they believe in. And having then laid it all out, I contrast their beliefs with the Hinduism and the principles of Hinduism that I've described earlier. Theirs is fundamentally different. I'll give you one very good example since you asked about Hindu Rashtra. Golwalkar and Upadhyay both rejected the Constitution of India. They said it is a flawed document. First of all, they rejected it because they said it's a westernized set of ideas. written by Anglophile lawyers in the wrong language with the wrong concepts. They were completely scathing about the Constitution. But Upadhyay in particular, but building on something Golwalkar had written, made a very specific and very profoundly serious point, which is he said that the Constitution of India as written rests on a completely erroneous premise about what is a nation. He says the Constitution seems to believe that the nation of India is a territory called India and all the people on it. He says that is wrong. A nation is not a territory, it's a people. And the people are the Hindu people. Therefore, the Constitution should be written for a Hindu Rashtra. Now, these are two fundamentally different and incompatible ideals of what this country is all about. To my mind, the call for a Hindu Rashtra is violative of the Constitution and is violative of the very basic idea of citizenship, of equal citizenship of all. Whether you practice a particular faith or another or none, you have the same rights under the existing Constitution that will be denied to you by those who say this is a country only of the Hindus and that everybody else here is either a guest or an interloper. That is precisely the fundamental difference as to why people like me and many others, obviously in the Congress party certainly, and in many other parties I believe, reject the idea of Hindu Rashtra.
What about the idea of Hindi as a national language?
Well, you know, the problem is what you do about all those for whom it's not. You see, the problem with creating a single national language in a multilingual polity is that you'll inevitably advantage some and disadvantage others. So Shukla and Singh and Sharma, who have grown up speaking Hindi from birth, for them it's hunky-dory. Their instinctive natural language becomes the language of administration, of the courts, of the national agenda. And Subramaniam and Reddy and Menon, who have not grown up with this language because it's not theirs, have grown up with other languages, suddenly become second-class citizens. That would be a recipe for breaking up the country. To my mind, if you want to preserve India's unity, if you value the idea of India, it can only be a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual, multicolored India. That's the only India that can survive. The moment, instead of unity, you start emphasizing uniformity, you will destroy India. It's as simple as that.
But I have a couple of other questions for you. You did mention the fact that the Prime Minister was at Davos. Everyone talked about how India was being viewed differently now than maybe a few years ago. And you have considerable experience in international diplomacy. How do you see this rise right now? How are you reading into it? Have things really changed? Wouldn't you agree that the Prime Minister has, moved in leaps and bounds internationally?
Actually, with all respect, no, I don't agree, because I've actually seen Davos when the place was festooned with banners hailing India as the world's fastest growing free market democracy. That was the slogan. I think it was 2007 in Davos. India, the world's fastest growing free market democracy. It was the toast of Davos. There were receptions. There was also a keynote speech by the then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. There were dinners and galas and various European women wearing saris for the occasion and all of this stuff. I mean, India was celebrated before in Davos, and God willing, it will be celebrated again. We have a very short-term memory, it seems. When we celebrate Mr. Modi's very impressive level of energy and dynamism that he has brought to his travels around the world, I am not one of those who criticizes that. I think it's very good that the Prime Minister of the country is out there and is showing his personal energy and commitment. But don't forget that he's neither the first nor will he be the last. There have been good moments for India on the world stage before. Let's not forget that when President Obama, towards the end of his 8 years in office, was asked to name the three top world leaders whom he admired, the very first name he came up with was Dr. Manmohan Singh. How quickly we forget that we have had a certain standing in the world not that long ago.
If we look domestically right now at the economy, do you see us in a job crisis? Do you see us in an economic crisis? What do you think we're doing wrong?
Well, I think there's a mixture of things. Certainly government policy is always to blame, and we in the opposition will blame the government. But there's also certain challenges which go beyond the government's control. For example, there is no question that Make in India, in a sense, has come at the wrong time, because you're asking people to make in India when the things they could make in India they would now rather not make with human beings anywhere. They'd make with machines instead. So Mr. Modi's first major announcement under Make in India was a Foxconn project valued at $3 billion. Yes. Have we seen one penny of that $3 billion in the 3 years since the announcement was made? No. Has a single pile been driven into the ground to lay the foundations of a big factory that will employ thousands of Indians? No. So can we blame Mr. Modi? Only up to a point, for being perhaps seduced by that logic. But we can't blame him for the fact that Foxconn says, hey, why are we going to build a factory in India and employ thousands of Indians who will be unionized and have human demands and needs, and we'll have to set up schools for them and housing for them and all that, when we can get machines to do it for about the same price once you even out the costs. That kind of thinking is also part of the problem. But we do believe that the government has not shown enough imagination in getting young people into the job market. And one simple thing that, everyone has been urging, and I certainly have been doing so in Parliament and elsewhere, why doesn't this government invest more money seriously in tourism? $1,000 invested in tourism employs 8 times more people than $1,000 invested in manufacturing. But we're putting all our dollars into manufacturing where nothing's happening, and we're neglecting tourism where something could happen. Dubai and Singapore get more tourists in a week than we get in a year. Now, we can change that around because we have the most magnificent buildings, palaces, ruins of various sorts, scenic sites, etc. But people won't come until we seriously invest in improving the tourist infrastructure. Give them clean, decent places, for one thing, to visit and stay in.
Safety?
And safety. Well, safety, to some degree, the Western preoccupation with safety is an exaggerated one, because even with the worst headlines that we've all lived with, assaults and violence and robbery and so on are much less in India than many other tourist hotspots that get more tourists. I'm not excusing any of it. It should be cracked down upon. But I think the picture is a bit overblown in terms of safety in India. Certainly, Jamaica seems to have no shortage of getting tourists. But every tourist I know who goes to Jamaica is terrified to step out of their hotel or their beach because of the level of crime in that country. No offense meant to Jamaicans, they have to live with it first and foremost, but I'm just saying we don't have a situation like that yet.
I also want to ask you about demonetization in GST. GST was cleared by both houses of parliament, by opposition and government, and then there's been a fair amount of criticism after that in the manner it was implemented. Do you believe that demonetization in GST have hurt us?
Of course.
And what is your reading then of the IMF and the World Bank giving the government good report cards?
Well, demonetization was a bad idea implemented badly. GST was a good idea implemented badly. That's basically the only difference. Demonetization, there is simply no credible argument for the enormous amounts of disruption and suffering that was caused for negligible return. In fact, hardly any money failed to come back into the system. Even counterfeit money and other kinds of black money appear to have been laundered in the process of demonetization. Meanwhile, over 135 people lost their lives in episodes connected directly to demonetization. The economy stagnated, daily wage workers lost their jobs, many micro and small enterprises closed. You can't imagine the number of things that could have gone wrong, that did go wrong, and that were not anticipated by our government. So demonetization, there is nothing good to be said. I've written an extensive paper on this, and I will completely refuse to buy any argument by the IMF or anybody else that it's done any good whatsoever. GST is a slightly different story. GST is something our own government was clamoring for. For 8 years, we tried to get this through the opposition. But amongst our most staunch critics and defenders and obstacles was the Chief Minister of Gujarat, Mr. Narendra Modi. The government of India just couldn't get the opposition to agree that GST would be a good thing. In the end, as you know, the BJP came up with a somewhat different GST bill than we had. It included preposterous ideas like a distinction between producer states and consumer states, which we rightly and staunchly opposed. We were pretty much alone in fighting for the return to the kind of simple, clear, one nation, one tax approach that had lain behind our original GST concept. I used to tell Europeans, you have one common market and 27 sovereign nations. We have one sovereign nation and 27 markets, where every time you cross a state border, you're seeing trucks lined up to pay octroi or excise or get their goods weighed or pay bribes or whatever else they were doing. We have to get rid of this if we want to really be a thriving economy. And so GST in conception was a good one. But look at the dog's breakfast they've made of it.
But when it passed through Parliament and it was supported by by the Congress party and the rest of the opposition at that point. Wasn't there a responsibility if you thought it was going to be bad for us as
Who resisted it as long as we did? We were essentially in the end isolated. In the Rajya Sabha, it was the Congress party that stalled the adoption of this version of the GST until finally the BJP managed to prize away from the opposition coalition enough parties that they would have got it through anyway, and the Congress didn't want to look like the dog in the manger, the stick in the mud, whatever, that we are the one party standing in the way of a much needed national reform. And of course we were constantly being reminded this was your idea in the first place. And you know, the cliche that I've flung at the BJP many a time, that where you stand depends on where you sit. You're now sitting in government, and everything where you had the opposite stand when you were in the opposition, you've now turned around and started adopting. And most of the BJP's economic achievements have literally all begun as UPA ideas, including GST. So we said, all right, let's not be the final obstacle. But we had made it very clear, for example, right till the last day, we wanted a constitutional amendment that would have prohibited the GST going above 18%. The BJP refused. They gave the very specious argument that you can't put a number in the Constitution, which turns out not to be true. There are numbers in the Constitution. But not only did they get the law without that amendment, but they've cheerfully gone ahead and adopted a 28% level, which is of course a disincentive to honest taxpayers. There's tax evasion taking place as well as rip-offs of people. Somebody goes to a Kirana store and buys 5 different items. The mom and pop running the store are not going to give them 5 different bills. They'll charge 28 on everything because it's easier for them when they have to pay their GST.
One of the criticisms that the government is actually talking about right now is the fact that fuel is as expensive as it is. 80 rupees for petrol in Mumbai, 68 rupees for...
Principally expensive because of tax.
But they say the opposition states refuse to allow it to be brought under GST.
So this is an issue on which certainly there is definite room for discussion. I would say petrol and diesel are one thing, electricity is another, alcohol and tobacco are a third, where states have deliberately sought to keep them outside the purview of GST so they have a source of revenue themselves. And indeed, the result is not healthy.
Would Congress states support moving fuel into GST?
I can't speak for all of them, Faye, and it's
Yes.
you know, within the party, it's not my area of responsibility. Speaking for myself, I would certainly be willing to try and persuade people on all states of all parties that it's healthier for India to have one tax on all items. But it should again be one tax. I'm not at all a fan of the 6-tier GST that this government has brought in. It's like, you know, you were asked to unleash a sleek camel on the field, a sleek horse on the field, and you've built a camel. That's what these guys have gone and done. So instead of one nation, one tax, you have one nation. First of all, you have 3 taxes because you have GST, SGST, CGST, and IGST. And then you've got 6 rates, which, you know, the bizarre addition of the 3% for gold. Clearly, the buyers and sellers of gold have some friends in high places. That was not even initially foreseen in the Interstate Council. So there's a lot of nonsense going on about the way in which this, and small business people, small and medium enterprises, having to fill in essentially 3 forms a month plus an annual form, so 37 forms in 1 year. They're going bonkers. They're saying, how can we do this? We've never done this before.
But from a customer's or a citizen's point of view, I paid 70 rupees for petrol when crude was at $140 a barrel.
Exactly.
I'm paying 80 rupees for petrol when crude is now at
63, 64.
So,
but that's mainly because of the government's taxes, not only state taxes. Central government taxes have been huge on petrol. We calculated that the central government has raised taxes in the last 2 years by 128% on petrol.
But the central government's argument is that 40% of that goes back to the states.
There's also a state component, absolutely. Yes. Which is why we need to simplify it. I'm all in favor of simplifying it.
Well, a couple of the other things I wanted to ask you about, of course, we're going into budget session. What are you expecting from the budget? It is closing in on an election year.
Yeah, this is their last budget, really, their last full budget, because even under the existing schedule, whether or not they advance the date of the election, as rumors would have it, even under the regular calendar, the next year's budget will basically be a vote on account. They won't be able to do a whole lot. So this year's budget is the last full budget, and it seems to me that it's going to be a political budget. It's going to have sops for everybody. They will have to address the genuine problems of rural distress. So I'm expecting some things for the agriculturists. There may be some gestures towards poverty alleviation issues. We don't know what those will be, but the perception that the poor maybe getting alienated. That, after all, the BJP, even in Gujarat, did very well in the cities, but rather badly in the rural areas. So the rural poor are alienated from them. That's one thing. There's got to be some stuff for investment, to encourage investment, particularly since Indian companies are at last turning the corner in terms of profits. They'll have money to invest and incentives to invest in India. And then finally, I suppose they've got to do something concrete about jobs, though I'm not sure what they will do, because I don't imagine that a young man at 18, 19, 20 years of age in UP who voted for the BJP because Mr. Modi promised him a job, if he still doesn't have a job 5 years later, can again be persuaded to vote for Mr. Modi. I mean, the Hindutva appeal will, of course, be trotted out once more. But
do you believe he can be persuaded to vote for the Congress?
Well, that's our challenge, I must admit. But in many ways, the answer will vary from state to state. I think there will be some states in which we are the default option. There are other states in which we're the obvious opposition party, and there are other states in which we may come after a regional party. But either way, the point is that disillusionment with the BJP is real and palpable.
Will triple talaq be passed through the budget session?
I don't know. We feel that it's not a bad idea to have it looked at in detail by a committee, because it's somewhat unusual in our jurisprudence and our legislation to criminalize a civil offense. I don't think anyone is in favor of triple talaq. Don't get that wrong. The Congress party wants to see triple talaq gone, but is criminalizing it the best way to go? Because after all, why is it that women are resisting triple talaq? They feel they still need the protections that a husband in a marital situation is obliged to give them. You throw the guy in jail, he's not going to be giving them support. So are we looking after the interests of women? We need to look at, there's not been enough reflection.
There's some criticism, of course, that the Congress's stand on triple talaq is what they call minority appeasement.
Obviously, this kind of cliche is flung at us whenever it suits the government and the Hindutva forces. What is minority appeasement? Showing respect for the interests of people in this country who have as much a right to the label of Indian as any Hindu does, to my mind, is not appeasement, it is respect. Now, the fact is that on this issue, both sides have people from the Muslim community. There are many Muslim women who say triple talaq must go, and there are many Muslims, including some women, but arguably more men, who say that this way of doing it is actually an assault on Muslim personal law.
So you don't foresee the possibility of it passing through the budget session?
Look, possibility I would not deny, but I would say our preference is that it go to committee first. The budget session has two halves. There's a session right now from the 29th, when it began yesterday of January, to the 9th of February. There's a second part from the 5th of March to the 6th of April. And it's not impossible that the committee could look at it before that and come back during that period. We'll have to see. But I just want to stress that the important issue is we want to make sure there is no other agenda that acting in haste to sort of give a blow to Muslim personal law or whatever, that the government isn't committing any sort of serious mistakes that could haunt our legal system in the future. Particularly the aspect of criminalizing a civil offense needs a look and needs discussion. We may in the end up going along with this bill or with minor amendments, we don't know. But I'm not in the Rajya Sabha. In the Lok Sabha, it passed as the government submitted it because they have an overwhelming majority. In the Rajya Sabha, many parties have views. We'll have to see how that goes.
Well, right around the Gujarat elections, Rahul Gandhi was made president of the Congress party. Again, criticism about nepotism because there are more experienced, perhaps more successful people within the party. What is your response to the fact that this is still nepotistic, it's still a party that relies on one family?
Now look, the Congress party's sort of DNA is inextricably woven with that of the Gandhi-Nehru family. I don't think anyone would deny that. It's history, it's become that way. I mean, frankly, I'm a Johnny-come-lately in this. You're asking the wrong person. I've come into the Congress party just in the 2009 election. And I would argue that the real proof of Rahul Gandhi's fitness to serve as leader of the party is that really nobody in the party, none of the various experienced people you talked about, felt it necessary, advisable, or otherwise to run against him because they knew that he would win. The party workers would bring him to victory.
But is that really the healthiest way?
Well, I mean, if you're saying that
it was called an election. It was not a nomination.
Well,
it was not
he was nominated by
a coronation.
he was nominated by the various state PCCs.
Yes.
So every state PCC nominated him, and each nomination form required multiple signatures, so large numbers of congressmen nominated him. So there wasn't, if you know, genuinely this was an unsuitable or unworthy appointment, somebody would have stood up and said, I can do better. Nobody did, because they knew two things. Number one, that it wasn't an unworthy appointment. Rahul Gandhi has tremendous qualities and appeal that, frankly, we already saw in Gujarat. But secondly, they also realized that if there was a free and fair election, Congress workers will vote for Rahul Gandhi and not anybody else.
So let me rephrase the question. Would Rahul Gandhi have won the presidential post of the Congress party if he was a Rahul Sharma or a Rahul Reddy or a Rahul Rao? Would that have happened? Because technically his qualities, his ability to deliver success to the party, irrespective of the name.
No, that's not the way it works. I mean, even in Western democracies, name recognition is a factor. If Hillary Clinton were Hillary Sharma, would she have been the presidential nominee of the Democrats? I don't know. She might not have got
would she have lost?
Off the
Perhaps,
first up.
yeah.
Who knows? There you are. Or if the two George Bushes weren't connected to each other, or the Kennedys. I mean, you know, name recognition in any democracy carries a certain value. So when you hear the name Rahul Gandhi and you know the connection to Indira Gandhi and Sonia Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi, and then of course via Indira Gandhi to the Nehru legacy, it brings a certain aura with it, a certain legacy, which many people are happy to see being inherited in the person of this young leader. But he's also, let's face it, good-looking, charismatic, energetic, all of these things that people also wanted to see in the leader of their party. Let's see those qualities come to the fore. We saw them on display in Gujarat, and they worked well with the voters.
Well, of course, there might be a general election coming up fairly soon, from what we understand. I also want to ask you about
one thing that we should not forget. One of Rahul Gandhi's most effective posters from the 2014 election came up towards the end of the campaign. I wish it had been there earlier. At a time when the country was being blanketed with posters of Mr. Modi, this one-man image, the Congress party poster was a marvelous one. It had about 20-25 faces, people in different parts of the country, different professions, different costumes, farmers, peasants, workers, also doctors, everyone around, and Rahul in the middle. And the slogan said, "Main nahi, hum." This is not about me or one person. It's about all of us. And that is Rahul Gandhi's style of leadership, which I think is well worth contrasting with Narendra Modi's. You're talking about a general election. I think you're going to see a main versus hum general election.
I want to ask you a couple of the other issues. The LGBT issue. You moved a private bill through Parliament. It hasn't really received the kind of attention that it should have. We have brothers and sisters in the LGBT community in our country, and the manner in which they're being treated is, quite frankly, undemocratic.
I agree.
And
I agree. I think that's why I felt it necessary to raise this bill. Not once, but twice. I was shouted down and voted out on both occasions.
By some members of your own party?
No. There was not one vote against me from the opposition benches. It was essentially a very strong cohort of BJP people, but there arguably weren't enough members on the opposition side to mount a robust defense, and we ended up losing. But let me stress that when you look at the merits of the issue, it's about equality. It's about non-discrimination. It's about I keep trying to explain to people, this is not about sex, it's about freedom. It's about what democracy is all about. But anyway, let's
now that we have a right to privacy.
Supreme Court,
yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
And my hope is completely that the Supreme Court will do what the legislators don't seem to have the courage to do. The right to privacy is one of them. The right to equality comes up. There is very much an idea. They've already agreed to do a review petition, as you know, earlier, on the earlier case. But now they've also said that they will take a petition by 6 gay Indians who said that their civil rights are essentially being affected by the persistence of the old approach.
And is love jihad fundamentally a bogey being used to sort of criminalize interreligious marriages in people's mind?
I think that unfortunately there are still people in this country who want to tell women whom they can love, whom they can marry, what they can wear, what they should eat, where they can go alone or otherwise, what they can study. Everything is sought to be curbed. And their inability to actually stand up and recognize the authority and independence and autonomy of women to make their own choices and lead their own lives lies behind many of these things. Love jihad is just one aspect of this. But for too many women, for too many men of this tribe, their honor is something they want to fight on the bodies of women. And I think we have to now stand up against that and say, actually, you don't have a right to do that.
Well, I have to ask you this question. The Delhi police investigation into your late wife's death has taken now 4 years.
4 years.
Why do you believe it's taking so long? What is your comment on that
Well,
case?
I would dearly like to know, because as you can well imagine, the family, her son, her brothers, and myself have been deeply, deeply anxious for closure for quite some time. 4 years is a very long time. And I feel particularly victimized by the length of the process, because all the innuendo and nastiness that's been flung about by certain malicious people targets me. Now, as far as I know, in these 4 years, the police have not established any crime or murder or suicide or any of this nasty stuff that's been bandied about in the media.
Mm-hmm.
So all I can say is that, I'm cooperating fully with anything they are investigating. But at some point, one would look forward to their coming to a conclusion and sharing it and explaining what that conclusion is based on. Only then would one be free to speak freely about the experience of the last 4 years.
My last question to you is, your vocabulary has become something of pop culture. There was a BuzzFeed quiz. Can you tell us what the meanings of these words are that Shashi Tharoor uses on a regular basis? What's your response to that?
Well, I was amused, I must say, initially. Because
you saw the quiz?
Yeah, it was sent to me by various people, and when Barkha Dutt tweeted it,
yes.
I think a lot of people suddenly started taking this quiz, and then, in my mentions, their scores started popping up,
yes.
So I realized it was on. Let me just say that, I don't use words to show off. I don't use words for any effect other than what the meaning of the word should convey in terms of embodying my thought precisely. I just read a lot. I've never studied a dictionary in my life. I grew up in India without television, without Nintendo, without computers, without mobile phones.
Maybe that's
all
why.
I had were books. And all I had were books, and so I read books extensively. You come across a word in 5 different books, you'll pretty much figure out the meaning without having to go to any great effort of bugging up a dictionary. Somebody actually came and said, "So do you study 5 words in a dictionary every day?" And I said, "No, I don't. I actually, hardly ever need to consult a dictionary, because my vocabulary comes from very extensive reading, and that's all."
There was also a social media campaign to make you the Prime Ministerial candidate of 2019. What's your response to that?
I think they don't. I should be grateful for all the high-minded, good people, well-intentioned people who seem to think well enough of me for that. Mm-hmm. But they don't have the slightest idea how our politics works, do they? I mean, there is absolutely no realm of possibility within which such an ambition is worth entertaining, and so I don't waste time thinking about it.
All right, Mr. Tharoor, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.